Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us for the AX virtual event sponsored by QuickTag. I'd like to introduce Jeremy Center and James Yount, who are both Dynamics AX consultants here at IBIS Inc. Today's webcast will be on data migration tools in Dynamics AX. Thanks, and let's go ahead and get started.
Hello, my name is Jeremy Sentner, and I am an AX consultant with IBIS. And I actually focus in trade and logistics and data migration. And I've worked with AX for about the past 3 years, completed about 8 projects, and really focused the last year and a half within the data migration area with using both the Excel add-in tool and the data import-export framework tool. And I'll let James go ahead and introduce himself.
Hey everybody, I'm James Yount, and I'm a senior technical consultant here with IBIS. About 4 years of experience in the Dynamics AX space, starting off with 2009, but primarily over the last 3 years it's been a very heavy AX 2012 focus. Some of the key things I do are integration, design and development, as well as modification, design and development, and data import, export, customizing entities, things like that. Certified in development, trade and logistics, and manufacturing, and worked on a whole space of different projects, anywhere from the pharmaceutical industry to food and beverage companies to manufacturing companies, as well as just general, business kind of companies. I'll hand it back over to Jeremy to start off with the DIEF tool.
This slide here is kind of just a summary of what we're going to cover today with the DIEF. Used to be known as the DMF, so you'll see some of the Microsoft documentation mention it either as the DIEF or the DMF. And first off, we'll go through an introduction of what an entity is, how they're kind of used, and then go into what staging table is in regards to the data import-export framework. And then actually target execution, and going in and looking at the history of that execution, which is the best way to actually troubleshoot if any type of error or issue occurs while you're trying to run the import. So those are kind of the general summary of what we're going to cover today. Going into the DIEF, there's a couple terms that you'll want to know. The source is wherever the data is coming from, so whether it's a file, an Excel file, a CSV, comma delimited file, or another existing database that can be linked to AX. Basically, wherever the data is coming from is going to be referred to as the source. Moving on down the list, there's the staging table, which is basically a temporary table that holds data prior to being pushed out to the end result of AX. So you can actually move data into the staging temporary table and edit the data, look at the data, and then actually make sure everything looks okay before you push it to the target, which is the next bullet point here. And that's actually where the data is going to end up. So it's going to show up in the front end of the software, and you'll be able to actually see and use the data once the target has been executed. One thing that I will mention that we won't cover today, maybe in part 2 of this series, is a composite entity. And what that is basically anything that is grouped together. So if you're importing open purchase orders or open sales orders, you actually have to bring in the header and the lines. And so that's what we refer to as a composite entity. Go ahead and pass it over to James for the next slide.
Kind of building off of what Jeremy was saying in the last slide, there's 3 key sort of steps that data flows through when you're using the DIEF tool. The first thing you're going to hit is the staging table, and this is just a single table entity within Dynamics AX where when you do your initial load of data, everything's going to populate into this one single table. There's no structure as far as behind the scenes where your final target may be 10 to 15 tables you're populating. The staging table is just all of the fields that you may be importing. There's some basic validation that's performed based on relations that may be set up on it, but for the most part, validation on this table is very minimal. Once you've gotten your data populated into this staging table and you're ready to move it over to the target entity, in between that you can have a processing class for your DIEF entity. What this processing class is it's going to contain several methods that you may use, sometimes you may not. These are for things where you may want to populate or create associated data that's may not exist in AX. So talking about inventory today, you may want to add a method into this processing class that says hey, if this warehouse or this site doesn't exist when it's running through the import, go ahead and create that in AX before trying to push it into the target query. So this processing class handles any kind of code you may want to have processed in between the staging and the target. The target query is basically an AX query object, and this is what defines, the final structure of all the tables you'll be populating within AX through the DIEF tool. So the staging table is going to contain all the fields that are going to be in your that may be in your target query. There could actually be extra in the staging table, again, if you're using the processing classes for populating other data. But this target query will have the structure of all the tables and all the associated relationships. So if you've got headers and lines, this is where those relationships are going to be enforced, and you'll see the structure on that. And it's going to have all your standard table validation. So item IDs, it's going to have links there that are going to check for your item IDs, check for your warehouses, things like that, making sure they exist. So it'll have all the validation you have if you're just going around creating records in AX. So between these three, these are the main components of the DIEF. When customizing DIEF, it's a pretty simple process. Again, if you want to add, say, a custom field into AX and then import that through the DIEF, it's quite simple. It's just adding a field to the staging table that data can come into and live in until it's ready to go to the target, and then updating your target query with that new field and making sure the names on those line up. When the names line up, pretty much behind the scenes automatically, it's going to link those two fields together when you run the import. So adding custom fields, things like that, is really kind of a simple process as far as the DIEF is concerned. Now I'm going to hand it back over to Jeremy here.
Okay, thanks, James. There's basically a few steps to running the data import-export framework. The actual data migration process as a whole is a little bit more cumbersome and a little bit more intricate. Basically, using the DIEF, James covered the three main pieces that you need to run. But a lot of the things need to happen before the fact of actually running the import, and that would be actually mapping some of the fields, identifying what data that you're going to be bringing over if you'll be using the import-export framework or the Excel add-in, and then you could actually get into building your template and bringing in the data. So this is just an overview of basically the 9 steps that you would need to move data successfully. And what we're actually focusing on today is moving inventory through the 2 different data methods in AX, the Excel add-in and the DIEF. And when using the DIEF, you're actually going to be using the inventory journal entity, and we'll go into what exactly an entity is and how they're used here in a minute in the actual system. But it's just important to note that you can bring in inventory adjustment journals or inventory movement journals. Those are typically the 2 that you're going to be using to move inventory in and out of the system. And from here, I'm actually going to share an environment here, and we'll go ahead and go into some of the different basics around the DIEF, and then we'll actually run through an import. So starting off here, the DIEF is actually its own module here. AX has built a specific area for this so you can secure it and keep it to limited users. And there's a few areas of setup that we need to walk through first. I'm going to touch on these very briefly, as this is more of a functional overview and demo versus actual setup and configuration, but I would like to touch on this for a quick second. So under the setup menu of this module, you have something called the target entities. And the target entities here actually are going to show you everything that can be imported through standard AX through the DIEF. And as you can see, I think there's over 90 of them now. But you can also create and add fields. You can create custom entities for tables that don't exist, and a number of other different things from this form. You can actually modify the target mapping as well. And like I said, this is actually going to show you all the different entities that can be imported. So you would see the one that we're working with today called the inventory journal here. Moving down the setup list, there's an area called the source data formats. Now this is actually defining what type of source data you're going to be bringing in the system. Here I have 3 of the major source data formats set up that are typically used. And what you do is you just name the source, whatever fits the description of what you're trying to do. And then you actually are going to set up this area over here to match the file import that you're bringing in. So as you can see, I have a CSV comma delimited file, so it's a delimited with a column delimiter of a comma there. And if you have multiple values, that's what this is used for down here, such as if you were bringing in a customer and you had multiple phone numbers for that customer, you could actually bring them all in at one time using this separator here. One other thing to touch on that we won't really be using today would be if you were trying to import with financial dimensions. You can actually set those up here on the application tab and specify whatever financial dimensions exist in your system and bring those in as well. The third piece of setup and configuration that you need to do is actually setting up the parameters here. And really the main parameter here is just setting up the shared working directory, which is essentially just a file you can create on a shared drive that the DIXF can read from. Once you have that in a correct place, you can click validate and you'll get this little green checkbox and you'll know you're ready to go and ready to actually do an import. Now, when you are ready to actually run your import, create your file, and get your data into the system, you're going to have to use this area over here, which is called the processing groups. Now, as you can see, I have a few processing groups I've created, and typically just name them over whatever you're trying to import. As you can see, I have an inventory one already created and working. For this example, I'll go ahead and create a new one so you guys can see the process from beginning to end, and that will give you a better idea of how this whole process works. So a processing group is actually going to hold the entities that you're importing. So if you were going to import a sales order or a purchase order, you could create one of these and hold the composite entities that I spoke about earlier. So if you could bring the header and the lines within one processing group, and you wouldn't have to process those separately. When you're creating one of these processing groups, it's pretty easy. All you're going to do is create new and name it. You have to name it something other than what's already in the list there, or you'll get an error. So we'll call it inventory 2 for this purpose. And now we're ready to actually start building our template to bring data in the system. If you click this Entities button, you'll see a new form pop up, and here is where we're actually going to find what we're importing. So for this case, we would be doing the inventory journal. And on the second column here, you're actually going to define, choose which source data format you want to bring in the system. And for this, we're going to go ahead and do a CSV file, because that's typically what works the best with this journal import. And then there's two options. If you know what fields you're bringing in already and you know what AX calls them, you can actually put them into a file and generate the mapping from your file. But if you don't know what they're called and you're kind of newer to AX, you can actually use this wizard that is built into the DIXF, and it will help you build the template that you need to bring into the system. So what you see is this wizard pop up here, and it's actually going to let you define what fields that you need to bring in the system. Some of them are mandatory, as you can see here on the right, and this checkbox on the left is going to say whether we think it's going to be present in our actual source file. So is it going to exist in our Excel file as well? This is what you're actually selecting. So there's a number of different fields you can choose from. You won't need to use them all. It's going to be more specific to what exactly you're bringing in. Journal type will be used to determine whether it's an inventory adjustment journal or an inventory movement journal. You can bring in the cost amount and the cost markup and the cost price, but this version of DIXF will actually populate that for us from what is existing on the item in the system. Line number will specify what line number of the journal we're looking at. There's description, and obviously a lot of the other fields such as the invent site, invent warehouse, some of those other fields that are going to be typically used, as well as the quantity. So there's a couple of things we can do from here. You can generate a sample file, which is going to populate the fields that you need in your source file to be mapped correctly. But if you actually know all the fields as I spoke about earlier, you can actually create a file in advance and it will generate the mapping for us. So for this example, I've created a spreadsheet with the fields that we need, starting with the journal ID, identifying the actual journal number, the journal name, so with the journal name created in AX, already set up, the journal type, whether it's an inventory movement or an inventory adjustment journal. As I stated before, the line number of the journal, the transaction date. Go ahead and change that to today's date so we're current. Description if you want, the item number. If you have a configurable item, you can put the configuration, the quantity that you're actually moving, and if it's a serialized item, you can move in serial number, batch number, pallet, as I stated before, the site, warehouse, location, and pretty much any fields that you need to bring in that are related to these journals. The biggest difference to which type of journal you're going to be bringing in is kind of what you're trying to do. If you need to bring in an offset count, then moving in an inventory movement journal is ideal for that, whereas if you're doing an inventory adjustment journal, that's not required information. That's the biggest difference to the two. And as you can see in my file, you can actually import them both at the same time. So go ahead and save the changes there and close my file out. And from here, we can actually open our file, and it's going to populate it here in the file path. Now, if we didn't go through that wizard, we could actually just go ahead and click this Generate Source Mapping, and it will read off of our file and automatically map those fields for us. To see the mapping, you can actually go into this Modify Source Mapping button. And you can see this little graph of kind of how everything is mapped, and you can adjust these. An easier view for me is to move over to this Mapping Details view where you actually see what's in your source and where you're mapping it to in AX. So this is good that these all map correctly and look the way they should, which is why it said that the mapping was done successfully there. You can also validate the data, which runs a number of business validations that James spoke about earlier, and also preview the source file to see what the data is going to look like when you bring it in the system. And depending on how much data you have, depending on how long it will take to populate, as you can see, this kind of matches what was in my CSV file that I showed you previously. So we know that it's going to be hopefully a successful import. From here, what you're going to do is go ahead and get staging data. Now, this is the process that we had spoken about earlier about actually moving data to a temporary table and pushing it there, and we can actually view the data if we need to. From here, we can actually preview the data as well. And you can see the preview of it here as well. If it all looks good and you're ready to go, you can go ahead and click Run. And as you can see, we got 10 records moved into the system the way that we wanted it to. So what that's done is actually put them into a staging table, and we can view and edit the data there. If we see that the data is good and we like that that's successful, we can actually push data to target, and that's actually going to move the data into AX to where we can see it, we can mess around with it in the journals, we can validate and post it. And we'll go ahead and click Run. And we got 10 records created successfully. So that's a good sign. There was 10 records in our file. We got 10 records into the system. And we're going to go ahead and go view that data now over in the Inventory Warehouse Management module and in the two different journal areas here. So first we'll look at the Inventory Adjustment journals. And as you can see, I've got the ones that I imported here. And if we go into the lines, you'll actually see all the information that we imported. So we have the item number, the sites, the warehouse. It's important to note that this version of AX will go ahead and pull the InventDim ID, the lot ID for us. And you can see my configuration and site and warehouse was brought in successfully. So if you want to validate the journal, you can. And if everything looks okay, you can also post the journal. And the journal posted successfully, so that's a good sign. And now we have that inventory on hand. And I'll just go and prove out my other point of the inventory movement journal here. And as you can see, the other ones that I've brought in. And if we go into the lines there, you can see a lot of the same information, except here you notice that we have that offset account that was brought in successfully. So that is the general process to actually moving inventory into the system. It's pretty easy once you learn the DIEF and the fields that are required. Again, you can move them in completely with all the information filled out, so where you can just post right away like I just did, or you can move in less information and manually configure some of the pieces if that's more comfortable for you. So that's the general process of moving inventory in. Now, if I go back over to the DIEF framework, there's a couple of things that we can do here. I wanted to cover some basic troubleshooting and some topics here. The best way to troubleshoot and see what has been going on with an entity in an import is by going to this execution history. Now, this execution history will show every single time that this processing group has been run and the status of each stage of the import. So whether it made it into the staging table and whether it made it to target. So a lot of the times you won't get an error into the staging table, but you'll get an error going into the target table due to a number of different things, but generally there's more business validation on the target import than there is on the staging import. So that's a good place to start for troubleshooting. And if you find something that looks similar to this line here where it says ended in error, ended during, it processed correctly on our staging table and it failed on our target, you can actually go in and look at the staging data as I kind of spoke about previously, and if there were numerous lines on here, you'd be able to see which lines were moved in successfully and which lines failed. As you can see, this says error. If it was successful, it would say completed. And you can actually go through and update the data in the system right here and then push that to the target from here rather than adjusting your source file and fixing the errors there. So that's typically what you would do if you needed to troubleshoot. And the nice thing about this is if you had, let's say, 10,000 journal lines, you could hit Control-T and it's actually going to go ahead and spit that data out into AX to where it's filterable, and you can filter on what was errored out, what was completed, and it just makes the whole overview process a lot easier to figure out what's going on. So that's the general process of troubleshooting and looking at errors. We'll make a side note that generally, if you do get an error, it's due to a duplicate primary key. So if there's a primary key that you're looking at, such as in this case, if you were moving in customers, if there was a customer in your Excel file that had a duplicate account number, then you would get a primary duplicate key error. So that's just something to look out for as you work through this process, is to look for that error. And if that thing pops up, then the easiest way is to shoot your data out to Excel and find the duplicate value and remove one of them. Other than that, there's some other things that you can do with the DIEF, such as creating a custom entity and doing some comparisons between companies. That's for a different session, but that is the general process for moving inventory. Now I'm going to go ahead and let James take back over. And James, if you want to move into any other technical pieces around the DIEF and into the Excel add-in, that would be great.
Okay. Yeah, Jeremy covered all the key points with the DIEF there, and I'm just going to, now we're going to transition over into the Excel add-in, which is just another tool for, either uploading data or manipulating journals that you may have already moved into AX. So much like the DIEF, the Excel add-in is just a very helpful tool for whenever you're uploading data, or, conversely, you can also manipulate data that already exists within AX, and you can do it all from the Excel interface, which most people are going to be more familiar with, especially those new to AX. Being able to use Excel is just a lot easier and quicker for some people to pick up on than it may be in some other ways. So again, you'll just be using the Excel front end when you're going through this. And the key thing to remember when you're using the Excel add-in is you can pull data or use data from 3 different sources. I've got them here. They're listed kind of in order of least complex to most complex as far as AX is concerned. From the add-in, you can just straight pull down an AX data table. So this is just going to basically query the database for that specific table. and allow you to create records in there, update records in there. There's not going to be any logic around it, and there's not going to be any structure if you're trying to manipulate multiple tables through the Excel add-in. Those linkages are not going to be there if you're just using the AX data tables for the Excel add-in. Increasing the complexity a bit, you can also use AX queries. So any query that's already in AX or a custom query you create, this will allow you to pull down data and have that structure between tables. So if you're trying to manipulate multiple tables that are linked together, you can build a query for this, set it as a data source for the Excel add-in, and that way you'll have that linkage and structure between the tables when you're going to do updates or pull data down. And finally, the most complex data sources you can have for the Excel add-in are going to be your document services. For anybody familiar with the AIF framework, which is the Application Integration Framework, these are the same document services you use there. They are also built off of an AX query, but there's also a lot of business logic that may be built around them as part of the import. And there are several that are standard out of the box. So things like inventory journals, customer document services. A lot of these are going to already exist, and they're a little simpler to kind of pull down and have that data structure as well as the business logic you'd normally expect actually working through the Excel add-in. I'm going to walk you through that. I'm now going to switch over to the Excel add-in. So again, using the Excel add-in, you're going to have the same interface you usually see with the Excel. But what you're going to have at the top in the ribbon bar is you're going to have a Dynamics AX tab specifically for the add-in. First thing you're going to need to do before using it is come into this design group and this add data button. Here's where you're going to be able to choose your data source for what you're going to manipulate in the add-in. The first option is going to be add data. And what you're going to see here is this is going to pull any queries or document services that you have set up in AX to be able to use with the Excel add-in. So this is going to be queries and services. We come to add data and set add tables. This is going to give you the entire list of every table that is in the Dynamics AX environment. Again, using these, there's not any logic built around it. It's a straight, pull or push into the database when you're doing updates or reads. And you are going to have to sort through, all these AX table names. So for those who are, not, really familiar with the back end, you're going to want to avoid this particular data method. But for, database administrators or somebody that's more familiar with the technical side, they may just want to select tables to pull in. Right now, to show off a few more things, I'm just going to go ahead and pull in this general journal entry as a data source. Now, the general journal entry data source I pulled in, that is actually based on the AIF document service for general journals. Like I was saying before, you actually get some structure around the tables that are coming in versus if you just pulled a table, you would just see your table name here. So we have the ledger journal table, which is going to be your header. And then you have your journal lines here, which is going to be your line attached to that header. And the fields here are not going to be all the fields on the table. They're just going to be the ones that are available on that service or in that query. And it's simply drag and drop to add those fields that you're going to want to use. One little trick that a lot of people tend to find very useful is over here under Filter. This will allow you to add different query parameters or filters that you want to do. If you don't have anything here, if you read down data using either a query, the table, a service, it's going to pull every single record that it finds. In a lot of cases, you don't necessarily want to see every journal record that's in the GL journal table, or you don't want to see every single journal that's in the Invent journal table. So it allows you to add conditions here, where you can select the table, the field, and you can enter whatever criteria you want to narrow down the data that's going to pull. It can also be useful if you're doing uploads of multiple journals and say you want it to, after you do the upload, you want Excel to appear clean with all your fields to upload the next one. You put something in here that does not exist. So there's not going to be a company account value of not exist. So when you do your upload, it's going to execute a read operation to pull data back down. Having this criteria here of not exist just means it's not going to populate the Excel add-in with data you don't want to see there, or you may specifically want it to just pull down data for company 006 after you do your upload. There's a lot of different things you can do here. You can add multiple conditions, but it's just a useful trick to know that a lot of people overlook when you're doing a lot of journal uploads. That way you keep Excel clean while you're doing the uploads. And actually walk you through an upload and do some data modification of inventory journals. Jeremy's going to walk you through that.
So what I'm going to do is actually pull down the data that we imported and show you that we can adjust on the fly, run some updates, things like that. So similar to what James was just showing, we're actually just going to the Add Tables portion. So we're actually going to select the tables that we want. And for this purpose, we need to bring in the Invent Journal table. And the Invent Journal Trans table. And what that is going to bring the header and then the lines of the journal in. And so what that did is actually loaded the two tables that we selected here on the left side. As you can see, the Excel add-in will actually populate the mandatory or the key fields that are needed. For this purpose, we'll go ahead and add a couple of fields here to the journal lines, like quantity, and see if there's anything else that we want to bring in. Okay, and when you're actually ready to pull the data down, you just need to exit out of the field selection menu or it won't let you refresh the data. And then you can go ahead and click refresh. What that does is it's going to go out to the AX database, pull down the live data that's in the system so it's real time, and show you everything that we need to see here. The nice thing here, similar to what James was showing earlier, is that you can filter off things that you want. So we'll just go ahead and select a variety here to filter on, and then you can actually change the quantity or a variety of different fields that typically you need to update. And we'll just change the quantity, for example, and we can hit publish. Once you get out of the actual grid, it will let you publish it. When you're actually in the grid, it will restrict you. It says you're in edit mode, which is what that message I just got was. And so what this is actually trying to do is publish information out to AX. And then you'll see this little Dynamics AX status bar that pops up. It adds another sheet for you. And then from there, you can actually see what was published and what failed. So as you can see, our two records were published, and they worked correctly. So we updated those two quantity values to have new values there. And then you'd be able to see that actually in the journal. So that is typically how you'd want to use the Excel add-in. In my opinion, as far as data migration is concerned, is mainly to do updates to journals that exist. The DIXF does a lot of the legwork for you and typically is helpful in moving in that information. Again, the Excel add-in is typically better just to update information, in my opinion. Other than that, that's what I needed to show around the Excel add-in. James, was there anything else that you needed to show around that?
Nothing from my end.
Okay. Well, I guess that concludes our presentation as far as what we're showing, but I know there's a question and answer session that is at the end of this. So if there's any questions, feel free to type them in the Q&A section, and James and I will do our best to answer them. We'll leave it.
We have a question come in asking, is the DIF part of R3 or is it also available with R2? And it is available with R2.
The Excel add-in will work with AX 2009 to answer Matt's question. The DIF actually is introduced in AX 2012.
All right, well, thank you for joining us today, and thanks so much, James and Jeremy, for presenting. It was great.